thinkers. Welcome to this week's Thinking Podcast. I'm your host, Jeffrey Wu. And I'm really excited to have this week's guest. Her name is Dr. Brianna Stubbs. And she's world-class in a couple different disciplines. And I think that's very rare for just people in general, right? You have people that are experts in one specific field. I think we're lucky to have someone that's experts in two very distinct fields. So she just recently finished her PhD in ketone metabolism at Oxford University. And her side job has been a professional rower on the Great Britain rowing team, where she recently won the 2016 World Championship for the 4-person lightweight crew. So I think she's got a ton of interesting information and content for us today, both in terms of her science and research into the ketone world, as well as being a top performing athlete. So happy to have you here.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you.
So one thing that I think is very interesting is that at NutriBox, in our biohacking community, we got into this world of exogenous ketones, ketosis, through fasting, right? So like a big part of our mission has been, let's enhance one of the core aspects of humanity, our cognition. And obviously nootropics is one interesting lever, but two has been fasting. And a big part of fasting is, well, lowering all calories, especially carbohydrates, which means that we have to elevate ketones or ketosis, get our bodies to use fats instead of carbohydrates as our energy source. And that's an interesting biological phenomenon. I'm curious to hear your perspective and how you got into the space of ketones.
It was all very much kind of by accident, and it's kind of a funny story because I was an undergraduate student in my first year at university, needed a little bit of beer money, and I saw an advert for a study. And at the time I was rowing with the Oxford University crew. The study was looking at rowing performance with or without ketone drinks. And I mean, at that point, the biology kind of passed me by a little bit, and I was just like, £50 to go and do rowing machine training. That's pretty much what I'd be doing anyway.
Yeah.
Like, I'll go and get involved. Oxford seems like quite a cool place to be doing a research study. You know, these scientists are probably pretty cool. But I didn't think too much about
so like
the detail.
18, 19 at this
Yeah,
time.
I was like basically still a kid,
right,
and just really enjoying being at university. Like, it was a really immersive experience, living away from home. I was having a great time, and if only I'd known like where it was like doing this study was going to take me. And so I signed up and I met the research team, and it was being led by Professor Kieran Clark and Pete Cox, and they're two of the most fantastic scientists I've ever worked with. And Pete was running this study, and he was just so passionate about this ketone drink that he was studying that it really got me interested in the biology then. And doing the study, they had blinded me to the drink, so they'd made the control drink taste really foul, and then the ketone drink at that stage they were sort of working on it, but it still was quite bitter, so didn't know which drink I was having. And I did these 2 rowing machine tests and didn't necessarily find out straight away what the outcome was, but I kept in touch with Pete, and sort of when the study was finished he shared the results with me, and that was that the ketone drink seemed like it was a really useful thing for athletic performance and improving performance. And so that really like caught my imagination, and keeping in touch with him gave me opportunities to kind of get involved in the research as an undergraduate student. So I did my undergraduate dissertation working with Pete and Kieran, looking at the ketone ester. And then I decided that I was going to pause my studies for a little bit to focus on my own rowing career, which had kind of been like ticking along quite nicely while I was at university. So while I was going to focus on the rowing, I wanted to get a job to help me pay the rent and like feed myself. Although as a lightweight rower, I didn't need to eat much, and it gave me another really interesting angle on like ketosis, because I was calorie restricted quite a lot of the time. My body was almost definitely going into ketosis more often than a normal athlete. So anyway, that aside, I worked for them for 1 year as a research assistant, and that was when I really started diving a lot deeper into the biology of ketosis. And I was lucky because my undergraduate had been pre-med, so I had quite a good grasp of like the human system. And also as an athlete, if you're switched on, you can get more out of yourself by understanding your body. So I was coming at it from a place of having a really inquisitive mind, and like a real hunger to like find out about how everything that I was changing about my training and about my diet, and potentially supplementing with something like ketones, how was that going to affect my performance kind of as a student athlete, because I was juggling studying with the rowing. So I was working with them as a research assistant and focusing on the rowing, and while I was doing that, the opportunity kind of arose to apply for a PhD, and that's when I took it. And then three and a half years later, kind of here I am, having won the World Championships and also completed a PhD. And I remember there's been so many times along the way where I never thought that I would get here, and it's a fantastic kind of feeling to be able to look back and see what I've achieved.
Yeah, no, I think just to give like context to listeners out there, I mean, being a world champion level athlete or just a world-class person in any domain is a full-time job. And then doing a PhD on top of that is another full-time job. So like, I'd love to, and later in the conversation, talk about how you manage your routines and get so much done in such a short period of time. But I think just going back to like the ketone itself, I think you come from a very interesting background, because I think in most of nutrition and most of biohacking, you either have people that are purely on the academic sense or purely like, on the experimental, like I'm tinkering and feeling myself. And I think that on that spectrum, as an athlete, like you almost treat your body as a machine, like purely in what we talk about a lot, like treating your body as a system. Inputs into that system are very predictive of certain outputs that you want to optimize for. So I think you probably have one of the most intuitive grasps around all the possible inputs into your system.
I think as well, you kind of get an appreciation of the fact that what works for you might not work as well for other people as well. And so getting this really strong sense that you can give advice, but people have to really like own their own bodies and make their own decisions about what works for them. So what works for me might not work for someone else quite as well, but being your optimal self involves taking a bit of initiative and like being tuned into yourself. You can't just, there's not necessarily like 10 steps to success that works for every single person to get their most optimal like performance.
Well, I think that would be the holy grail that
would be
we would want to help solve, right? Like I think all the inputs are there, just like we don't know how to quantify them. Just
it might be
it's like based on your genome, it's based on like certain characteristics or certain activities you want to optimize for.
Yeah.
But once you have like all these puzzle pieces together, then one could theoretically
it's going to be like a buffet, right? And it's like, well, for you, because you're like more heavily like you're an endurance athlete, you need to like really work on these areas, and you're a sprinter, you really need to work on these areas, and you're not an athlete at all, but you're a computer programmer working really, really long hours, and these are the things that you need to address to make yourself optimal. But it's about having like the toolkit or the options available so that people can equip themselves as they need to achieve their specific goals. But the tools that each person needs are going to be like slightly different.
100%. I think that's where I think biohacking as a populist movement, really starts making sense. Because I think medicine and healthcare today is very much one size fits all. We have like our, big insurance, big pharma. These are the processes, and we're slapping people through the system. And it will have to evolve into something that's much more personalized. Yeah, and that's a whole. That's a whole another like can of worms we can definitely dive into as well.
Yeah.
I want to just like sort of just zoom back out, even back to your childhood and your upbringing. I know that you were the youngest person to cross the English Channel. Definitely the youngest woman.
In a rowing boat.
In a rowing boat. How how did you decide to I think most of us growing up, aren't like, hey, I want to, like, I don't even know how to be like the best of anything or the first of anything. Like, what's your story? Like, how did you always just like sort of go for these high achievements?
I'd really like to credit my dad for this. He actually took part in the first ever ocean rowing race from Tenerife to Barbados across the Atlantic rowing race. And he saw a newspaper article that was like, Che Blythe seeks men to take part in a challenge that rivals Everest. And he's always had this real like passion for pushing himself and for doing extreme sports and for life just in general. And that I was brought up in like an atmosphere that really like fostered that. So as I was growing up, my dad was planning firstly this row, which happened in 97, so I was about 6, and then after that he was really bitten by the bug, and it takes quite a long time to plan these projects, but he actually made 2 more attempts on the North Atlantic Ocean between me being sort of 6 and me being 13.
So across the entire North Atlantic Ocean.
Yeah, so he made it all the way across
3,000 miles.
Thousands of miles. Okay. But also just even to get on the start line, fundraising to build the boat and equip the boat and all of the training and finding the team. They weren't supported at all, so they're in the boat in the middle of the ocean like by themselves. And so when you're a kid and your dad's like in the middle of the ocean, miles from anywhere, and doing this sort of like extreme endeavor, it just really makes you feel like anything's possible. And he always used to use this quote by T. Lawrence that was like, the dreamers of the day are dangerous men because they act out their dreams with open eyes and make it possible. And he had that on a lot of his sort of stuff that he was sending out to sponsors, and I was surrounded by that as I was growing up. And my parents, neither of them went to university. No one in my family had been to university until I did, and so it's not like I was coming from a high achieving academic background. Parents, medical doctors or lawyers or anything like that, but they just always encouraged me. And I know it sounds cheesy to always tell your kids that they can do anything, but they didn't. It's true. I think. So I remember my dad was planning one of his sort of other rows, and I went into his study and I was like, what can I do? What can I do? Can I like do something with you? Can I go and row the channel? And I think that like planted a seed with him, and then it just sort of came together. He obviously had the boat and the team, and they were doing that sort of training, and it worked. But I remember I did my first ever like competitive sport race aged about, I think I was 7, and my dad would take me training. We lived by the beach and by some cliffs, and there was zigzag path up the cliffs, and he used to make me run up this path until I was sick, and he used to love it. He used to I was this little tiny little girl, and he'd be like there shouting at me to go faster, and he just always encouraged me, and he taught me that there were no boundaries, and to push myself as well. And yeah, he was a fantastic like figure in my life, and
no, that's fascinating. I mean, I think a lot of us, I mean, especially in America, you grow up playing some sort of sport. So like I was in AYSO soccer, played basketball. I started focusing on tennis and played tennis, fairly competitively up until playing high school. We were like the number 2 ranked team in tennis in California, which is a pretty competitive state. But like I never was like, hey, I plan to be like a professional tennis player. Like was there a point where I was like, oh, I'm like not just good at this, I could like really be a world champion at that? Was there like a turning point when you're like young, or was it just like this is fun, I'm pretty good at it? I think what was the turning point?
So the actual turning point, like what you were just describing, actually happened really only when I decided to take time off my medical degree, because I was really, really driven academically as well. Applying to Oxford, I got a scholarship to go. So I was to a 6th form school where I could do the rowing as well. So I'd always been academic and sport, like kind of running both tracks parallel. And actually, I don't think I ever really won anything until I won the Under-23 World Championships. I was always like 2nd or 3rd or 4th. I was always, and a lot of people who, when I was like 15, 16, who were beating me at rowing, dropped out. And I just like kept on going. A lot of people just don't. They don't have the staying power. I mean, sport is really hard. Yeah. And especially when you're growing up as a kid, there are loads of other things you want to do. And I think everyone reaches that point at some point in their life. And I guess now I'm at a point where I'm thinking about my athletic career and whether or not I carry on or not. But this is the first time that I've ever contemplated not doing sport. And some people just get there earlier. They're kind of like, well, I want to be a student, go out and enjoy, meeting people and socializing or traveling. There's just so much to do. Right. And it's like what you decide to pour yourself into. And whenever I speak to like groups of kids, I always say that I was never the best until I was the best like very recently, and it was more just because I kept at it and kept at it and kept at it. But it doesn't work out for everyone, and it has worked out for me, but maybe not even to the extent that it's worked out for other people, and that I've never been to the Olympic Games. I'd like to think I'd have been good enough to compete at the Olympic Games, but I've never had that opportunity, and so there's only a small percentage of fairy stories, and it just depends whether you get enough out of doing sport to make it worth your while. And I think that rowing has always given me like a massive sense of self-confidence and self-belief, and like you have to be really meticulous, and it's always taught me so much and like really formed me into the person that I am today. And so I think the more you persist with it as a kid, the more you get out of it long term. But I see what the distractions are, and it doesn't mean that you're any less of a person if you decide to pursue something else, because you have to be brave to make that decision as well, rather than just carrying on because
Yeah, no, I think that's like one thing that I realized growing up was that there's a lot of smart people, a lot of like reasonably capable people, but I think the people who make it across are like people who like are persistent, right? It's like people took themselves out of the competition, even though they're like they could have had potential, but like if you're like the last person standing, well, you win, right? It's just,
exactly.
So it was interesting. So like it was
put in the hours and put in the graft and keep backing yourself. Because that's where you get to, I won bronze medals all the way through sort of like at the national level, all the way through sort of like 15, 16, 17. and I won a silver medal at the junior. I managed to get selected for the junior world championships, and that was my first international representation, aged 18. But what had happened the year before that was that I'd been the next ranked person from being on the team. And I remember, I think I was like 17 at the time, and you go and you do like a week-long selection camp, and you do loads and loads of racing. It's physically very tough, and when you're a 17-year-old girl, like emotionally really tough as well. And I remember the coaches all went into the meeting, and they came out, and my coach told me that I wasn't going, but I was the next ranked person, and and in fact they'd given the spot for the spare spot, so it wasn't even the spare. They'd given the spare spot to someone who hadn't even been at the selection weekend, because they thought that she could, at that stage I couldn't do sweep rowing and sculling, so I was only a 2-oared athlete, not a 1-oared athlete as well, so they'd given it to someone who could do both. And I can see why they did that, but I was gutted because I thought that was my spot. And I remember crying the whole way home, and next year coming back and being like, no, I'm in this now. And so, which
I think is like good response, right? I think a lot of people are like, fuck it, I'm done.
Yeah,
like,
so it's your
response
to failure as well. Is really
so you're
important.
just like, nah, like screw this, I'm gonna come back and like prove you wrong. So you have like
and
that chip on the shoulder.
Perhaps as well, like going back to when people decide whether or not they're going to carry on. I think so. I went to a camp that was run by Dame Kelly Holmes, and I don't know whether American listeners would have heard of her, but she was a famous British athlete who won gold medals at I think it was the Beijing Olympics in both the 800 meter track and field and the 1500 meter track and field in the same year. And so I went to a camp that she was running, and one thing that she said that really stuck with me was never ever stop when you're on a low, because she had a lot of problems with injury and things like that, and she was like, if you're on a high and you want to stop, then it's the right time. But I think quite a lot of people make the mistake of like getting kicked down, and then they're like, oh, this is way too hard, I'm going to stop. And so I think you're much more powerful position to make that decision, like objectively, if you're successful. Like if you're successful and you want to move on and do another challenge, then that's a much more powerful place to make that decision.
That's actually interesting, because it kind of reminds me of a quote or story from a so I did Y Combinator, which is like a startup accelerator thing that's relatively prestigious for my first company, GlassMap, and then Mark Zuckerberg was a speaker there, and he had like an interesting quote that I think is like very similar, where it's like you're never as like in every cycle of any company or any endeavor, there's like you get blown up as like you're the best company ever, or like you're a failure, you're the worst company ever, like. And he was saying that you just like don't believe like how good people say you are, and and you're never as bad as people say you are. So it's like I think it's like that decision making process, right? Like you don't want to be making decisions when you're like your ego is huge on one hand, but you don't also want to be making like decisions when you're like low, you're really low, when people are saying like, oh, Facebook is like the worst company ever, like it's just like some way to pick up girlfriends or boyfriends in your college network. So I think
all the best things go through like iterations where people have struggled, and but then equally things that might seem really successful right now that might like not necessarily be the way it turns out. And so I kind of relating that back to my own story, pretty much all of the people that were winning gold medals when I was 15, and the national championships was like the end of the world, oh no, I only won bronze, this person's won gold, they're the next big thing, and actually now they never made anything of their rowing career, and I'm a world champion, so it's
powered through.
Yeah, exactly.
So how did you decide, because I know that a lot of student athletes are much more athletes than students.
Depends what sport you're in,
right? Like to be honest, right? Like I think that's like been like just a controversy in like American collegiate athletes, and it sounds like you were not just like a student athlete, emphasis on athlete. You were legitimately like at a world-class PhD program that you just recently completed. So like, how were you able to balance that? Why did you decide to pull triggers on both? Because I think that's like it's like almost abiding more than a typical hardworking person can choose. Like not just being ambitious on one thing, like you can be really ambitious on two things at the same time.
I think I probably didn't know exactly what I was letting myself in for before I was kind of in and like just struggling to keep my head above the water. There was a point when I'd been doing the program, was in the British rowing program and the PhD program for about 3 or 4 months, and I remember I was sick from doing the training and knackered from doing the studying as well. And I remember sitting in my car in tears on the phone to my parents, just being like, I can't do this. And I had a meeting with my supervisor, Kieran Clark, and she was like, you should stop doing your PhD, and like, because you're really good at the rowing and you should do the rowing, and you can't carry on doing both. And there was a sort of like crisis point quite early on
Right.
in, and I was just like, this is just not gonna work. But
Right.
what I had to do then was take a step back and work out a way to make both fit, because the typical schedule for a PhD student was just not compatible with the typical schedule for an athlete. So I had to find, for the rowing team, so I had to find a way to make both of them work. And actually, I think the solution that I came up with in terms of just my week schedule was really optimal for me, because it gave me headspace when I wasn't rowing to, studying really helped me switch off from rowing. And that was just, for me, it was a good outlet. Both of them worked from one another. One of them was a radiator, the other one was a sink, and so they kind of complemented each other. It was only crap when both of them weren't going very well, but luckily that didn't happen very often. At least when you're sick and you can't train, you could kind of do the work and read papers and things like that. So they did complement one another in the end, but it wasn't a match made in heaven. And I ended up doing the two almost by a happy accident. I taking the time off medical school because I didn't want to go and do my clinical training, because I knew that I would be away on placements, which would mean that it was quite difficult for me to do the training. So I thought that doing a PhD, a research degree, would give me a little bit more flexibility with my time, and that was the case, because luckily I had a really fantastic supervisor, Kieran. She gave me a lot of freedom with my schedule, and once I built that trust with her, and once you start delivering for people, they back you. And I think in that initial 3 months where it was difficult as well, I was trying to create an impression of myself for her and for all of my other research colleagues in the lab, that I was the real deal, that I was going to work hard, and I wasn't just doing it just as a free pass to do the rowing. And there were some comments that people made, like, you're here to do a PhD at Oxford, not to row, and I took all of that very personally, and I was just desperately trying to convince them that I was committed. And then on the other hand, I had the rowing people being like, oh, you're a part-timer, you're not like... But then when you start delivering the results at trials, and you consistently, I was hitting my PBs, and people can't argue with results. So you have to find a way of getting results. The solution for you, it might not be the way that either party would want, but so long as you produce results,
you're doing it.
So long as you produce results, people are happy. And I had conversations with the head of the British rowing team, and they were like, up until now your results are good, but we think they'd be better if you weren't doing your PhD. And I'd argue with them, not to their face, but I would argue that actually, why would it be better? You can, as an athlete, you develop at the speed that you're going to develop. You can do everything that you can to accelerate it. But I've been doing this.
There's a lot of downtime to recover, right? And it's like, okay, if I'm not going to be working out, I might as well be reading science papers.
And there have been parts where doing that sort of thing and doing my PhD has been physically not the best recovery, because I'd be getting up super, super early and fitting in sessions before I'd go and do experiments. And there was even one ridiculous time where I was running an experiment on a rat heart, and you had to stand and sort of supervise this while all the science was going on. And I was just standing, and I was like, I'm late for training now. I was meant to go to the gym, and I was part of my session that I was meant to do was 20 minutes of body weight squats. And so I was like, well, I'm just standing here in the lab, I'm going to get a bench, and I'll stand here and I'll do my body weight squats here. And everyone else in the lab was like, what are you doing? I was like, well, training. Just standing there. My heart was beating, and I was doing squats. Just got to find creative ways to use your time. That's a bit of an extreme example. I didn't do that routinely, but I would routinely be in the lab on the exercise bike, and then finish half an hour before I had research participants coming in, and just go grab a shower, grab something to eat, boom, straight onto the science. It's just about efficiencies, and
I think that's what that's awesome. I think that's what we're all about. We have all the same amount of time, and if you're just and clearly some people do more out of their time than others, right? Let's all sort of help promote people, different techniques and tips to help people get the most out of their life, right? I think that's just a noble mission that I think we all can agree to. Let's help people be better versions of themselves.
And I think the longer that initially when I started doing that, I had mountains and mountains of energy for it, a lot more. And as it was as I've got a little bit older and been doing it for longer, I've had to protect a bit more downtime for myself to recharge emotionally and mentally to be able to do the stuff that I do physically. And so now something that I've started to build into my routine is meditation, 10 minutes a day. And sometimes I struggle to find time for that, but it is only 10 minutes, and if you protect that time, then you do it.
Beginning of the day, end of the day?
Whenever I can, if I'm honest.
Okay.
I'm not in a good enough routine with it yet, but I think it's something that's really trying to be mindful about protecting that time and doing that is something that's added to my output during the day. And I never used to have to make time to
Are you
recover.
like pretty rigorous about it? Like alarm clock, like?
I wish I could be, but
Okay.
I'm not that disciplined with that yet.
Okay.
But I get like, I try and do it in the morning most of the time. Yeah.
Yeah, I've been trying to get that in at the end of the day for myself, but yeah, it's hard if you're just busy. It's like
I think if
hard to be consistent.
I guess if I took the attitude that I'd taken to my athletic performance, like I need to do it, I'm going to do it, then of course I would do it. I need to be a bit strict. I need to be a bit stricter with myself.
Yeah.
I need to be a bit stricter with myself.
What other tips of the trade would you have to recommend or have stories about? I mean, I think clearly like you figured out like some sort of routine that allows you to be super productive.
Yeah.
Like any other things besides meditation?
I think getting enough sleep was really, really important for me. And again, like I was never perfect, but it was just about being aware. So it would be like, okay, I'm really tired during the day at the moment. My bedtime started to creep back from being like 10 and now it's more like 10:45.
Yeah, what was your typical protocol like?
So the alarm would go off at about 5:30. I needed a little bit of time to kind of like get up and going in the morning, and I found that was like I'm quite productive in the morning. So sometimes if I had a lot of work on or if I was organizing a research study, I'd get up and use a little bit. I'd have about 45 minutes before I'd have to leave in the morning. So while my breakfast was kind of making, or as I was making breakfast, I'd kind of just get a look in my mind straight what I needed to do that day, and if there were any emails that needed to be sent or any like little bits of admin that I could do in that little bit of time, I would do that then. Then I would drive to the British Training Centre, which is about a 45-minute drive, and that journey could be like I used that for whatever I wanted. So I'd either like listen to music if I wanted to de-stress, or if I was quite like keyed up about stuff, I'd use that time to like listen to podcasts, or actually that time, rather than being this like time that was wasted, became quite a valuable source of whatever I was kind of looking
content,
for. Either like kind of relaxation or content, right? Then I would always, I think something that became really important in my like athletic routine was making time to stretch and just get your body like fully prepped, ready for the workout, so that when you go into it, you're getting the most out of it, and also helping to avoid injury. That was something that I didn't do as much when I was younger, and now it's a really important part of my like pre-workout routine. And it kind of evolved over time. So I used to kind of just do, like stand there and sort of hold your quad a little bit and like maybe sort of do some lunges. But I really got into practicing yoga and sort of doing more like.
So this is the beginning of the day still. This is like 7:30.
This is we're probably at sort of like 7:15 now. So I'll be at the training center and I'll do sort of like 15 minutes, 20 minutes of stretching before we then go out and we go rowing. The rowing takes about an hour and a half, and so it can be. It's important to have clear goals for the session and kind of clear expectations of what you're looking to achieve and how you're going to measure those goals. And because it's such a long workout, it's hard to kind of keep your concentration all of the time. But if you beat yourself up about the fact that you're not concentrating all the time, then that's really counterproductive as well. So it kind of goes back to talking about mindfulness. So like, okay, I'm aware that now I'm thinking about work. Okay, what's the technical goal that I'm working on this session, or what's the speed goal? I'm now going to focus back in on that.
Like mindful training. I think.
So you get much more out of training if you're engaged with it.
Right.
But it is also recognizing that you're not going to be engaged all the time over like 100-minute session where you're just kind of going round and round in circles backwards.
Right.
Like rowing. It's quite a meditative kind of hypnotic sport because you're just doing the rowing stroke over and over again. And when you kind of get into the flow state with it, it just kind of takes off. But then contrastingly, if it's awful conditions or freezing cold or really windy, it can just be like pushing a boulder up a hill, and it's just, you're just like, why am I here? And it's just trying
It's only 8:30.
Yeah, well, you're almost finished by the time it's 8:30. So you start at 7:30 and we finish between like 9 and 9:15. And then after that, it's really important to refuel properly after the session. So I know you talked so I know you talked a little bit about the ketogenic diet, but rowing training is like quite a mixture of high intensity and lower intensity stuff, as well as a lot of strength training.